"Return everything I gave you and the kids," my husband said, standing in the middle of our kitchen on a Thursday evening in November, with his attorney's letter in one hand and the specific expression of a man who has decided he is holding all the cards. He meant the minivan, the children's tablets, the furniture he'd bought with money he now claimed was entirely his, and the house. Our house. The house where our daughters had grown up. The house where I had spent 11 years building something I believed was ours. He said it with the flat, certain tone of someone who has already won in his own mind and is simply administering the outcome. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because I had been extraordinarily careful, was that 7 days earlier I had found the folder, and that the folder had changed everything about who was holding what. But I need to go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters, and because you need to understand what was real before I can show you what wasn't. My name is Mara Voss, Mara Delacroix before I married Ryan, and Mara Delacroix again now, a name I reclaimed with a quiet, specific satisfaction that I find hard to describe, except to say that it felt like putting something down that had been getting heavier for years without my fully noticing the weight. I was 37 when my marriage ended, the mother of 2 daughters, Sophie, who was 10, and Clara, who was 8, and I had been working as a licensed accountant at a mid-sized CPA firm in Charlotte, North Carolina for 6 years, doing exactly the kind of careful, systematic, detail-oriented work that I was, as it turned out, going to need very badly in my personal life before any of this was over. I had a good eye for numbers. I had a better eye for when numbers didn't line up with the story someone was telling about them. I had spent 11 years applying this eye exclusively to my clients' books and not to my husband's explanations, which was a professional competence I had somehow failed to extend to my own household, and which I have long since stopped blaming myself for, because trust is not the same thing as negligence, even when the person you trusted used it the way Ryan used it. Our house on Whitfield Place was a 5-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood that had been established enough to have mature trees and wide sidewalks, and the specific quality of permanence that comes from decades of families deciding this was a place worth staying. Ryan and I had bought it in the 4th year of our marriage, when his commercial real estate development company was growing faster than either of us had fully anticipated, and when the purchase felt like evidence of a future we were building together. The house was large enough for the family we'd intended. We'd planned 3 children, ended up with 2, and the extra rooms became a guest room and a home office and a playroom that had, over the years, accumulated the particular geological layers of childhood: blocks under the beanbags, art supplies behind the board games, Sophie's abandoned violin in the corner where it had lived since she decided at 9 that the violin was not for her. I loved the house with the specific affection of someone who has made something a home through years of sustained attention, and the thought of losing it, when the thought finally arrived and couldn't be pushed away, was one of the most disorienting things I'd faced in my adult life. Ryan Voss was 41, the founder and managing partner of Voss Development Group, which had grown from a 2-person operation in a rented office to a 12-employee firm with 4 active commercial projects and a client list that included 2 regional hospital systems and a shopping center developer out of Atlanta. He was the specific kind of businessman who generates genuine results through a combination of intelligence and social confidence, and a particular gift for making people believe that their interests and his are aligned, which they sometimes were and sometimes weren't, a distinction he managed with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing it for a long time. He was sandy-haired and broad-shouldered, and had a laugh that came from somewhere real, and he had, for most of our marriage, been a person I was genuinely glad to have built a life with. I am saying this clearly because it matters. He was not a monster. He was a man who had made a series of decisions over a period of years that prioritized his own position so thoroughly that mine had been steadily, quietly, strategically dismantled without my knowledge. The distinction between those 2 things, monster and architect of a slow erasure, is important to me, and I'm not going to flatten it for the sake of a simpler story. Mornings on Whitfield Place had a texture I could reconstruct in any detail, The smell of the coffee maker completing its cycle, which Ryan had always set the night before because he was a morning person, in the way that productive, organized people often are. The sound of Clara's feet on the stairs, she ran everywhere, including downstairs, in the specific way of an 8-year-old who has not yet developed any self-protective instinct about hard surfaces. Sophie moving more deliberately, pausing on the landing to check her phone for messages from the friends who had become, at 10, the primary orientation of her social universe. I made lunches at the kitchen island while Ryan sat at the breakfast table with the financial news on his phone and his coffee. We talked in the efficient, abbreviated way of two people who have had years to develop shorthand, about the children's schedules, about weekend plans, about the minor logistics of a shared domestic life. He kissed me at the door at 7:45, on the cheek, the same spot every morning, the automatic gesture of a man who means it as affection and delivers it as habit. I handed him his travel mug. He took it. The mornings worked because we had spent 11 years making them work, and I had long ago stopped asking whether they were working for both of us or only for the structure we'd constructed around us. The object I want to tell you about is a ledger, not a physical one, a digital file named Personal/General that Ryan kept in a folder on his laptop called Insurance Reference, a name deliberately designed to repel interest, the kind of label that produces a specific variety of nothing when you glance at it on someone else's screen. I would not have looked at it if circumstances hadn't put me at his laptop for a specific practical reason. I would not have understood what I was looking at if I hadn't spent 6 years as an accountant. And I would not have known what to do with what I found if I hadn't spent the following week in conversations that began with my friend Patrice and ended with an attorney named Ellen Forsyth, who had, by the time Ryan made his pronouncement in our kitchen, built a case that Ryan's attorney had not anticipated, and that would undo every calculation Ryan had made in the preceding 2.5 years. But I'm running ahead again. Let me tell you about the small things first, because the small things were there before the ledger, and they matter. The first small thing happened in March, 8 months before November's confrontation. Ryan came home from a development meeting in a mood I recognized but couldn't locate, not exactly distracted, not exactly tense, but something in the range of both that registered differently from his usual post-meeting energy, which was typically forward-directed and slightly elevated, the mood of a man who has spent the day moving pieces and is pleased with their positions. That evening, he was quieter, and he spent 2 hours in his home office after dinner with the door closed, which was not unusual on busy project nights, but which had a quality to it that evening that I noticed and set aside. I'd become reasonably skilled at setting things aside. It was a skill that had served me and not served me in roughly equal measure over 11 years, and one I have since retired. The second small thing was in April, a phone call I half overheard from the upstairs hallway, Ryan's voice in the kitchen below carrying the specific low, quick register of someone covering ground without wanting to be followed. I caught 3 words clearly as I came down the stairs: not before closing. Not before closing what, I did not know, and when I appeared in the kitchen doorway, Ryan transitioned into another conversation with the smooth ease of someone who has practiced the transition, and I accepted the explanation he hadn't needed to offer, clients getting anxious about the Moorhead project timeline, because it was plausible, and because I was not yet in a place where I was looking for implausibility. I was still in the place where I extended the benefit of the doubt as a marital practice, which was a place I was going to leave, but not yet. June brought a pattern I recognized the way you recognize something you've been half aware of for a while and have finally admitted to seeing. Ryan had become, over the preceding months, more deliberate about the household finances in a new way. He had always managed most of the finances. This was an arrangement we'd settled into early in the marriage, when his income was substantially larger than mine, and the administrative organization of it was something he did efficiently and well. But he had begun, in the spring, to be more specifically directive about what I should and shouldn't engage with. Nothing overt, just a redirection when I asked about the investment accounts, a suggestion that I leave the mortgage correspondence to him, a gentle move to handle a call with our financial advisor before I could participate in it. Each instance was explainable individually. Together, they had the architecture of someone clearing a workspace before an operation.
The thing I would later identify as the moment I should have pulled on the thread harder was a Saturday in July when Ryan asked me to sign a document he described as a routine consent for a business account update. He'd handed it to me at the kitchen table with a pen already in his hand and the document already open to the signature page. A presentation designed to facilitate signing without reading, the specific format of something intended to be completed rather than examined. I am a professional accountant. I should have read it. I didn't read it because my husband had just handed me a pen and a document at our kitchen table on a Saturday morning, and I trusted him, and trusting him was what I did. I signed where he pointed. He thanked me, folded the document, put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, and went to make more coffee. I went back to the newspaper. I have thought about that signature many times since. I have also stopped beating myself up about it, because the fact that he relied on my trust to execute his plan is his moral failure, not mine. September was when I noticed the ledger, or rather, when I was positioned to notice it without intending to.
Ryan's laptop had been sitting open on the kitchen counter while he was outside with the girls, and I'd needed to look up a recipe, and my own phone was dead and charging upstairs, and I'd used his laptop for 30 seconds to search for what I needed. And in the browser history, which I hadn't been looking at, it was simply visible in the drop-down when I typed the first letter of the recipe website, was a URL for a document management system I didn't recognize, one of the cloud-based services, and the document title visible in the truncated URL was Personal General VDG Q3. VDG, Voss Development Group. The document was a business financial file, and it was saved under the name Personal in a cloud account I hadn't known about, accessed from Ryan's personal laptop browser. I stared at the drop-down for approximately 4 seconds, then closed it and typed the recipe search and found what I needed, and put the laptop back. I stood at the kitchen counter looking out the window at Ryan and Sophie and Clara in the backyard, Sophie trying to teach Clara a complicated hand clap sequence that Clara was getting determinedly wrong. And I thought about 3 letters in a URL and what they might mean, and I decided that I was going to find out. It took me 3 weeks to access the file, during which I said nothing and changed nothing, and maintained the morning routine and the dinner conversations and the weekend rhythms, with the specific discipline of someone who is playing a long game and cannot afford to show their hand. I want to be honest about those 3 weeks. They were among the hardest of my marriage, not because I was certain of what I was going to find, but because I was no longer certain I was going to be wrong about what I suspected. That uncertainty, the liminal state of a person who is about to know something and isn't yet ready to know it, has a specific physical texture. It sits between the shoulder blades. It wakes you at 4 a.m. and holds you there looking at the ceiling while your husband sleeps beside you with the even breath of a clear conscience or an excellent performance, and you cannot tell which it is. I lay awake on 4 separate nights in September and October, and I held the uncertainty, and I breathed through it, and I did not let it out through my face or my voice or the way I moved through our house. I found the full file on a Monday in October when Ryan was in Atlanta for a site visit and the girls were at school. He'd saved his cloud account password in the browser keychain, a small, fateful domestic carelessness, the kind that happens when you've been careful about everything except the assumption that your wife will never look. The document management system opened with the login, and the file Personal General VDG was in the primary folder. I opened it. What I found in the following 45 minutes, sitting at the desk in Ryan's home office with the door closed, and my hands making no sound against the keyboard because I had stopped using the keyboard and was simply reading, was a complete parallel financial record of Voss Development Group going back 2.5 years. 2.5 years. The ledger was immaculate. Ryan had always been meticulous, and it documented in precise columns a series of revenue streams and asset transfers that did not appear in the business's official financials, the ones that had been prepared by the firm's accountant and submitted to the bank and shared with partners. The discrepancy between the 2 sets of books was not enormous in the context of the total business revenues, but it was consistent, deliberate, and had accumulated over 30 months into a figure that, when I totaled the unreported transfers to a separate account, came to approximately $347,000. $347,000 that did not exist in the official books, that had been moved to an account I had never heard of, over 2.5 years, methodically, in amounts structured to avoid the automated reporting thresholds that triggered disclosure requirements. I sat with this number for a long time. The home office was quiet around me. The hum of the computer, the distant sound of the neighbor's leaf blower, the specific afternoon silence of a house without children in it. My hands were in my lap, and I was not moving, and the number was on the screen in front of me, and I was doing what I did with numbers. I was understanding what they said. What they said was this: my husband had been building a hidden financial reserve for 2.5 years, funded by undisclosed business revenue, maintained in an account outside our joint financial picture. And the account had been accumulating while he had, during the same period, been reorganizing our household finances in ways that reduced my visibility and access. The document I'd signed in July came back to me with a new clarity that settled into my chest like cold water replacing something warmer. I needed to know what I had signed. I pulled up my email and found the date, July 14th, and I searched Ryan's digital files, which I now had access to through the open session, for any document from that week. I found it in a folder labeled Administrative 2024. It was a consent form authorizing the removal of my name from a joint investment account that held, at the time of signing, approximately $98,000. My name had been removed from that account in July. The money was still there. I could see the account balance in the ledger, but I was no longer on it. I closed the laptop. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen, and I stood at the sink, and I turned on the cold water, and I held both wrists under it. Not my hands, just my wrists, and I breathed through my nose for 60 seconds. The water was very cold. The sound of it was ordinary. Outside the window, the neighbor's leaf blower was still going. I turned off the water and dried my wrists and picked up my phone and called Patrice. Patrice Lang had been my closest friend since we'd met in a continuing education course 8 years ago. She was a forensic accountant, which I had always found professionally interesting and was now finding personally urgent. And she had the specific quality of someone who hears difficult things without reacting before she's ready to respond. I told her, standing in my kitchen with my wrists still faintly cold from the water, in approximately 6 minutes, what I had found. She was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted, because I was counting everything now. And then she said, "How complete is the parallel ledger?" I said, 29 months of entries, consistent format, clearly maintained by someone who knows bookkeeping. She said, "You need to get a copy of that file before you do anything else. Not a screenshot, the actual file." I said I still had the session open. She said, "Go now. Download it to a personal drive or email it to yourself at an address he doesn't know. Then call Ellen Forsyth. She's a family law attorney. I've sent 3 people to her and all 3 of them came out right. Her number is in your phone." I texted it to you 3 months ago when I thought you might need it and didn't say anything because you hadn't asked yet. I stood in my kitchen and looked at my phone and found the text from 3 months ago, the number with just the name Ellen F. and no explanation. And I thought about my friend who had noticed something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge and had quietly prepared a resource for the moment I was ready to use it. And I said, "I'll call you back." I downloaded the file to my personal cloud account in 3 minutes. Then I called Ellen Forsyth. Ellen's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Trade Street, a space that managed to be both efficient and human. Not warm exactly, but not cold. The office of someone who deals with people in the worst periods of their lives and has learned that the environment needs to support function without adding unnecessary weight to it. She was 50, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the specific quality of attention that some people develop when they've spent decades listening to things that matter, and have learned to hear what's under the words as well as the words themselves. I sat across her desk on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after I'd found the ledger, and I laid out everything: the parallel books, the July document, the account from which my name had been removed, the accumulation figure, the 2.5-year timeline. I had printed the relevant sections from the ledger file and organized them chronologically, because I was an accountant, and organizing financial documents chronologically was as automatic for me as breathing. Ellen looked through everything with her glasses on, and her pen making occasional small marks in the margin of her legal pad, and when I finished, she looked up and said, "How long have you known about this?" I said 4 days. She said, "Good. He doesn't know you know?" I said no. She said, "Keep it that way until I tell you differently." She put down the pen. "The July consent document removing you from the investment account. Do you have a copy?" I said it was in the printed stack, third from the bottom. She found it. She read it. She set it down and looked at it for a moment, and then said, "He had you sign this at home without independent counsel?" I said yes. She said, "That's relevant." She paused.
The parallel ledger is the core of this. What you have here is documentation of marital asset concealment over 30 months. In North Carolina, concealment of marital assets is not just a factor in equitable distribution, it can constitute fraud, and fraud has remedies beyond the divorce proceeding. She looked at me steadily. The $347,000 in the undisclosed account is recoverable. The investment account from which your name was removed is challengeable, and the consent form, obtained with adequate disclosure in a domestic setting, is very likely voidable. She picked up her pen again. "I need a forensic accountant to review the full ledger and the business financials. Do you have a colleague you trust for this?" I said I did. Patrice Lang became the forensic accountant on the case. She spent 2 weeks with the full ledger and the official Voss Development Group financials, and produced a report that was, by her own description, the most clearly documented case of systematic marital asset concealment she'd reviewed in 7 years of forensic accounting work. The parallel books were meticulous. The transfer pattern was consistent and deliberate. The account receiving the undisclosed funds, a business account for an LLC called RV Holdings that had been registered in Delaware with Ryan as the sole member, had been accumulating not just the transferred revenue, but investment returns on that revenue, bringing the total accessible balance at the time of Patrice's analysis to approximately $412,000. The LLC had been registered 2.5 years ago, 1 month before Ryan had begun redirecting my access to household financial information. Everything had a beginning and a sequence and a direction, and the direction had always been away from me. I want to tell you about the week before Ryan's kitchen pronouncement, because that week was the one that determined the shape of everything that followed. Ellen had filed for divorce on my behalf on a Tuesday morning, and the filing included a motion for preliminary injunction freezing the assets of RV Holdings pending forensic review, a motion she had drafted with the specificity and documentation that made it, in her own assessment, very difficult to deny. Ryan was served on Wednesday afternoon.
He did not call me that afternoon. He called me at 9:30 that evening, after the girls were in bed, from what I realized was somewhere outside the house, because I could hear traffic in the background, and the specific ambient sound of a man who has stepped out to make a call he didn't want made indoors. He said, "You filed." Not a question. The voice of someone who is receiving information and is still deciding what to do with it. "I did," I said. The pause that followed was 12 seconds long. I counted. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Everything that's in the filing," I said, which was true and also incomplete, because what was in the filing was not yet everything Ellen had, and the additional documents were being prepared for the hearing that had been scheduled for the following week. He didn't respond immediately. I heard him breathing. I heard the traffic behind him. I heard the specific silence of a man whose calculation is running and not arriving at a satisfying conclusion. Then he said, in the voice of someone switching registers, "Mara, I need you to understand that what you think you found."
"Ryan," I said, with the quietness I had been practicing for 6 weeks, "I'm an accountant. I know exactly what I found." I paused. "I'll have Ellen reach out to your attorney in the morning." I hung up. I sat in the kitchen in the quiet house with my phone face down on the table and the refrigerator making its usual sound, and Sophie's backpack on the hook by the back door, and Clara's sneakers in the middle of the floor where they always were,
And I breathed through my nose the way I'd been breathing through everything, and I thought, 1 week. 1 week until the hearing, and then the shape of this becomes clear. Ryan came home the next day, Thursday, with his attorney's letter in one hand and the expression I described at the beginning, and he said what he said. Return everything I gave you and the kids. He meant the minivan, the children's tablets, the furniture, the house.
He said it with the authority of a man who believes he has already established the legal structure to enforce the demand, who believes the previous week's events have been the opening salvo in a negotiation he intends to win, who does not yet know the full extent of what has been documented and filed and prepared by 2 professionals who had been working for 3 weeks on exactly this moment. I was at the kitchen island when he said it. The girls were upstairs doing homework. The dinner dishes were not yet washed. The kitchen smelled of the pasta I'd made, and the light above the island was the warm domestic light of an ordinary Thursday evening that was not, in fact, ordinary. I looked at my husband standing in our kitchen with his attorney's letter and his certainty, and I said nothing for a moment. I let the words sit in the air between us. I thought about the parallel ledger and the $412,000 and the July consent form and Ellen Forsyth's voice saying the word recoverable. And then I said with a quietness that came from somewhere I'd been building for 3 weeks, Ryan, the hearing is Monday.
Everything you need to know about what I have will be in the documents Ellen submits Friday morning. I picked up the dinner plate I'd been about to take to the sink. We're not having this conversation in front of our children's homework time. He looked at me. Something moved through his face that was the beginning of an adjustment he hadn't completed yet, the recognition that the ground was different from what he'd mapped. He put the attorney's letter on the counter. He went upstairs. I washed the dishes. The Monday hearing was in Judge Patricia Caldwell's courtroom, a functional, well-lit space on the 4th floor of the courthouse where things were conducted with the specific procedural efficiency of a court that handles volume and maintains standards. Ryan sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, a man named Gordon Chase, who was reputable and well-prepared, and who had, according to Ellen, not received the full extent of Patrice's forensic report until Friday afternoon, giving him a weekend to prepare a response to something he'd had 3 weeks to anticipate, but had apparently not taken fully seriously.
Ellen sat beside me with the folder, and Patrice was in the gallery as a retained expert available for any questions the court had. I sat with my hands in my lap and my back straight, and the specific stillness of someone who has been preparing for this room for 3 weeks and is ready for it. Ellen presented the forensic accounting report first. Patrice had organized it with the clarity of someone who understands that the document needs to be readable to a judge who is not an accountant. The parallel books presented side by side in comparative columns, the transfer patterns highlighted, the RV Holdings account balance documented as of the previous week. Judge Caldwell reviewed the documents with the focused attention of a person who reads financial materials quickly and retains what she reads, and when she looked up, she said, with the directness of someone who has seen asset concealment cases before and is identifying this one clearly, Mr.
Chase, your client maintained a parallel set of financial records for his business for a period of 30 months, during which time he transferred $347,000 in undisclosed business revenue to a separately registered LLC. Is this disputed? Gordon Chase said, with the specific, careful language of an attorney managing a bad position, Your Honor, the characterization of those transfers as concealment of marital assets is that disputed? Judge Caldwell said. Her voice had the patience of someone who asks questions once. Gordon Chase paused. He looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at his hands. The transfers are not disputed, Gordon Chase said. The characterization is. The July consent document, Judge Caldwell said, in which Mrs. Voss's name was removed from the joint investment account, was Mrs. Voss represented by independent counsel at the time of signing? No, Your Honor. Was she provided with a full accounting of the account's value prior to signing? Another pause. The document speaks for itself. It does, Judge Caldwell said, and so does the forensic report. She made a note on her legal pad.
The preliminary injunction on RV Holdings is granted. The investment account is frozen pending review of the consent document's validity. Mr. Chase, I'd like briefing on the asset concealment issue by the end of the month." She looked at Ryan with the level gaze of someone who has made her assessment and is not revising it. "I'd recommend your client consider the full accounting carefully before the next hearing." She closed her folder. "We'll recess." The recess was 15 minutes. Ellen walked me to the hallway and said with the controlled satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what they set out to do, "That's exactly where we needed to be." I said, "What happens next?" She said, "His attorney is going to call mine within 48 hours. The full accounting is indefensible, and Gordon Chase knows it. They're going to want to settle." I said, "What do I want?" She said, "The house, your name restored on the investment account, half of RV Holdings, which is a marital asset, equitable distribution on everything else." She paused.
And attorney's fees, because what he did with that consent form was designed to take advantage of a domestic relationship, and the court doesn't like it. I looked at her. I said, "Then that's what we ask for." Gordon Chase called Ellen on Wednesday. The settlement negotiation took 2 weeks and was conducted entirely through attorneys, which was what Ellen had recommended, and which I was grateful for, because the 2 conversations I'd had with Ryan during that period, one about the girls' Thanksgiving schedule, one about the car insurance, had the specific quality of conversations between 2 people who are standing in the wreckage of something and are simultaneously trying to coordinate the practical necessities of life as parents. He was not hostile in these conversations. He was diminished in a way that I found neither satisfying nor painful, simply accurate, a man who had been reduced to the actual dimensions of a situation he'd built, rather than the inflated dimensions he'd planned to occupy. We were civil, we were parents, we were, in the most practical sense, already over, and the civility was what we owed our children rather than each other. The settlement was finalized in January. The house on Whitfield Place remained with me and the girls. 5 bedrooms, mature trees, the playroom with the abandoned violin, the kitchen where Ryan had said what he'd said in November, and where I had said what I'd said in response. The investment account was restored to joint status and divided equitably at its full value, including the appreciation that had accrued while my name was off it. The RV Holdings balance, $412,000, and the investment returns that had continued accumulating through the settlement process, was divided as a marital asset, my share arriving in a wire transfer to my personal account on a Tuesday morning in February that I watched process on my phone while sitting in the parking lot of the girls' school after drop-off. The consent form from July was voided, and the related transfer reversed. Ryan paid Ellen's attorney's fees, which were substantial, without contesting them. Ryan's attorney's fees were, by all accounts, also substantial, and, unlike mine, entirely unrecoverable. I want to tell you about the night before the settlement was signed, because it was the night I understood something about what I'd been carrying and what I was about to put down. I was at the kitchen island at 11 o'clock with the settlement agreement printed in front of me and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and the house quiet above me where both girls were sleeping. I went through the document the way I go through any document, carefully, page by page, every line, and the terms were what we'd negotiated, and the numbers were right, and the house was mine, and the account was restored, and the girls' schools were settled, and the custody arrangement was structured. I signed my copy. I put the pen down. The kitchen was quiet around me. The overhead light was the same warm light it had always been. The girls' backpacks were on their hooks by the back door. Sophie's lavender, Clara's orange, both of them exactly where they should be. I looked at the backpacks for a while. Then I looked at the settlement agreement with my signature on it, and the numbers that represented 11 years of a life being divided into its component parts and redistributed to the people it actually belonged to. I thought about Ryan saying, "Return everything I gave you and the kids," and I thought about what he had actually given me, tallied against what I had actually given him, and I thought that the accounting, when done correctly, when done by someone who knows how to read the real books rather than the presented ones, came out rather differently than he'd calculated. He had given me 2 daughters I intended to raise well.
He had given me 11 years of experience understanding what it looked like when someone needed to control a room before you could see it clearly. He had given me, in the end, a settlement that left me with the house and a restored account, and a share of a reserve fund he'd built in secret and lost control of the moment I found the ledger. What I had given him was my trust, and 11 years of domestic labor, and 2 girls who called him Dad, and would continue to, because they were his children, and that was the truth of it, regardless of everything else. I was not going to reduce their father to his worst acts. I was going to give them stability and consistency, and the best version of the house on Whitfield Place that I could build for them, and I was going to do it as Mara Delacroix, which was who I had been before, and who I was again now. 6 months after the settlement, in August, I was at the kitchen island on a Tuesday morning, reviewing a client file before my 8 o'clock call. Coffee made with the pour-over setup I'd bought myself in March. Ryan had always used the automatic machine, a minor domestic preference that had gone uncontested for years, and that I'd now replaced with my own, when Clara came thundering down the stairs and announced that Sophie had taken her hairbrush without asking. And Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs to contest this characterization with the full advocacy of a 10-year-old who believes she is right. And I mediated the hairbrush dispute with the particular combination of firmness and patience that I had always brought to these situations, and that had always been mine, regardless of anything else. The girls ate breakfast. I made their lunches. Clara's sneakers were in the middle of the floor. Sophie checked her phone. The morning had the texture it always had, the specific grammar of our particular family, the sounds and rhythms and negotiations of 3 people who live together and know each other thoroughly, and whose lives have the shape of lives actually being lived, rather than constructed for someone else's benefit. Ryan called on a Sunday evening in September, the regular call for the following week's logistics. The girls had a Thursday overnight at his apartment, and he needed to know about Clara's soccer schedule. We talked for 8 minutes about scheduling and snack requirements and whether Clara's cleats were at his place or mine, and the conversation was the conversation of 2 former spouses who are functional co-parents and nothing more, which was what it needed to be and what both of us had chosen to make it. When we hung up, I set the phone on the counter and finished making dinner and called the girls down, and Sophie helped set the table the way she had for years, and Clara put her shoes where they belonged for once without being asked, and the kitchen smelled of the chicken I'd made, and the evening light came through the window at the angle it always did in September, and I ate dinner with my daughters in the house that was ours, and thought about nothing except what was in front of me, which was the only thing worth thinking about. The ledger file was still on my personal cloud drive. I hadn't deleted it. I didn't intend to. Not because I needed it anymore. The case was closed, the settlement signed, the file archived, but because it had been the thing that changed everything, the document that had transformed the $347,000 question from something Ryan controlled into something I controlled, and I kept it the way you keep certain things whose significance exceeds their current utility. It sat in a folder on my personal drive labeled VDG, reference, which was a name Ryan himself might have chosen for something he intended to stay hidden, except that mine had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from being found. The ledger had been his instrument of concealment, and then when I read it, mine of clarity, and it would sit in my drive for as long as I chose to keep it, available and documented and entirely, permanently mine. My mother called on a Wednesday evening in October, 12 months after the November confrontation, and asked how I was in the specific way she asked when she wanted the real answer rather than the satisfactory one. I told her I was good. She said, "The girls?" I said, "Good." Sophie started the violin again. She laughed, the particular laugh of a grandmother who knows about abandoned violins. She said, "And you're managing the house?" I said, "Mom, I've been managing the house for 11 years. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the specific warmth of a mother who has been waiting to say something and is finally saying it, "I know you have, sweetheart. I'm just glad it's yours now." I held the phone and I thought about that, about the house being mine, unambiguously, in the documented and legal and practical and inhabited sense, and I said, It always was. We just had to do the accounting to show it. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. I went back to the kitchen and poured the second cup of coffee, the one I never used to have time for, the one I had time for now, and I stood at the window and looked at the September light on the backyard, where Clara's soccer ball was in the middle of the lawn where it always was, and Sophie's bike was leaned against the fence, and the morning was mine and the house was mine, and the coffee was exactly right, and for the first time in a very long time, the accounting added up. Return every